Now that we have a good idea about how to document processes using flowcharts, let's start taking a look at the systems we use every day to do our work. Humans perform daily processes that involve disks and folders and files on our own local computers. So increasing our Windows file system skills is important to optimizing those tasks. Ideally, once we fully understand them, a software robot can take over some or all of that work. Having a better understanding of the Windows file system will help users optimize and standardize their manual processes. It will instill greater confidence when building software robots and/or communicating problems you're having when using a robot that somebody else built. It will allow us to produce more accurate estimates about how long it might take to create a software robot. And finally, it can help new robot users be more aware of the value that a robot brings to the table. The learning goals for this section are going to be to identify which disks, folders, files, and paths are most commonly used in your processes. Then you'll want to correlate those items with the capabilities of the RPA tool you've chosen. Then, determine which steps of your process your chosen tool can or cannot automate. And finally, discover and/or become more confident with more efficient ways of using the file system that might help you perform or automate your process more easily. So let's jump into it. In my role as an RPA team leader, I've spent time working with business people who don't have as much tech knowledge as I do. And like I mentioned in the previous video, those people are performing processes involving disks and folders and files on their own local computer. I think it's important to be able to find things quickly and confidently, regardless of circumstances. And something I've noticed in many people is a habit of viewing files in icon view when they're interacting with their Windows file system. This is often accompanied by their Windows having many files in them, and the end result is they wind up scrolling around and they can't find the file they're looking for when the pressure is on. In my opinion, viewing your directories in this icon view is working against you. Number one, the icons themselves take up a lot of space on the screen, so your information density is low. Number two, the only thing we see are the names of the files. We don't have any other information about these files. And finally, we don't have the ability to sort this list in any meaningful way. It defaults to alphabetical sort. In my opinion, it's better to view folders using the details view. As you can see here, this gives us multiple columns. The icons are smaller, taking up less space on the screen. In the furthest left column, we see the list of file names. Then we see a column with the last date this file was modified. Then we see a column having which type of file it is. And finally, a column that shows the size of the file. So in this view, the information density is high, and on top of that, we can click on any one of these column headers and sort by that column, either ascending or descending. And I'll show you a demo of that in a minute. If you weren't already aware, you can control which view you experience by using the View menu at the top of any folder window. Simply by clicking on that Details item there, you'd be able to switch over to that Details view I was just talking about. It's also a good idea to show file extensions and hidden folders. So let's go have a demo and see what all this looks like. Here I've opened up my Documents directory, and you can see that it's in the Large Icons view. So as I mentioned before, these icons take up a lot of space, and I don't really have much information about the folders and files that are present here. So it's very easy to change this view by going to the View menu at the top of the folder window and clicking on Details. Now we've got those 4 columns I mentioned, and we can actually change which columns appear up here by right-clicking and checking and unchecking additional columns. There's even a More option down here that shows you all the possible column values. But for now, name, date modified, type, and size is fine with me. As I mentioned, we can see a list of the file names, when they were last modified, what type they are, and in the case of files, how big those files are. We can click any one of these columns once or twice to sort, ascending or descending. There may be times when you want to see a list of files that were most recently modified, and that's where it's nice to be able to sort by date modified, ascending or descending. And of course, size is useful when you want to see which files are taking up the most or the least space on your disk. As I mentioned, I also think it's important to select this File Name Extensions and also Hidden Items. Now we can see everything that's on the disk and we can see their file extensions as well. And you'll see more about why that's important when we start using our RPA tool activities to open and copy files. We definitely need to pass the file extension in any activities that do that stuff. As a final note, I also like to go into this Options, Change Folder and Search options, click on this View tab here, and scan through this list of items, because things like this checkbox usually default to being checked. And I would rather not have empty drives be hidden from me, because then how can I ever put files in there? This one is also usually checked as well, so I uncheck both of those, along with showing hidden folders, files, and drives, and things like that. So take a look through here and see if you want to make any changes as well. And if you do make changes, click on Apply to Folders, and agree to this dialog here, because we want all of our folders to look the same. Then click OK. So it may not be a big thing, but I personally feel like having one long vertical list of files with more information on the screen makes it easier to find things quickly as compared to dealing with this icon view that so many people use. So that's my recommendation, but of course you're still free to do whatever you like. The Windows file system is comprised of disks and folders and files. Let's start with a quick look at disks. A computer's disk drive is simply a container for folders and files. RPA software robots will frequently need to interact with disks and folders and files. If you've never really thought much about your computer's disk drive, this file cabinet is a good analogy. The cabinet itself is the disk drive, and you can see that it has two folders that can contain other folders that can also contain additional folders inside of those, and finally, files inside those folders. And usually you put meaningful names on the folders, and you order them in a certain sequence so you can find information quickly. There are many different kinds of drives, but all of them have a very similar paradigm. The disk itself is the container, and then you have one or more folders within the disk, and often folders inside those folders, and finally files. Users might have more than one disk available on their computer. Different kinds of disks are local disks, which are physically connected to a user's computer, and they could be either internal inside the computer or external, connected by a cable. Portable disks are temporarily connected by a cable, and this includes things like your mobile phone or a memory card reader. Network drives are attached to some other computer in the user's network, and a term we use is that those drives are often mapped to the user's computer, so they have quick access to them. Disks can also be on the cloud, which simply means they're on a computer provided by a third party, like Amazon or Google or Apple or Dropbox, but the user can still see the disk and has a way to access it. Disks are labeled using a letter, like C or D or J, on Windows computers. The C drive is present on every Windows computer. That's usually where the operating system is installed. A second disk for data is often labeled as the D drive. Network drives containing shared files can be mapped to a user's computer for quick access. And of course, this would also use a letter like J or L or K and so on. Removable disks can be attached and removed at will, and drive letters will automatically be assigned to those disks when they are connected. And they might not always get the same letter each time you connect and disconnect them. You might even use FTP servers containing folders and files on a disk as well. For a quick demo of this, I've opened up a Windows Explorer window here, and if I collapse this folders node at the top, you can see I have this devices and drives list, and that's on a node called this PC. So as mentioned, you can see that I have several local disks. My C and D drive are both inside my computer, and my G and J drives are external drives connected by USB cables. You can see when I plug in my phone that another device shows up in this list. And as you can see, this is called a portable device. But it's also a disk, and if I double click on it, I can keep drilling down until I see folders and more folders, which of course would be better to be viewed in the details view. And then if I double click on one of these folders, eventually we see files. I can get back to my list of disks by clicking on this PC, and there they are. In order to see the disk of an FTP server, we need to make a connection to the FTP server, and then on the left side of this FTP tool, I see my local disks, and on the right side of the FTP tool, I see a folder that exists on the disk of the FTP server. So of course, if I expand that folder, I see folders inside that folder, and I can now interact with the files on that FTP server, and if I need to, I can copy them down to my local disk and do something with them. Or I can copy files from my local disks up to the FTP server disk instead. Once you fully understand which disks you use every day for your processes, then it's a matter of finding out what kind of capabilities your RPA tool has with regard to interacting with your disks. Because ultimately, we want to have software robots being able to see our disks and interact with them in some way. More about that in future lectures. Now that we've discussed disks, let's dive one level deeper and talk about Windows folders. Folders, otherwise known as directories, are also containers that can hold other folders and files. Folders offer a hierarchical organization structure, which is thought of as a parent and child relationships. It's also referred to as a tree structure. We use separator characters, usually backslash or forward slash, to build up a path to any given folder or file. And I'll demo that in a minute. Given that we perform tasks with folders and files on a daily basis, our ultimate goal is to get software robots to do the same thing. And I'm happy to tell you that software robots can get a list of folders within a disk or folder. We just need to provide the robot with the right path to the folder that we want it to interact with. And in this example path here, you can see that it begins on a disk with the letter C, then it moves into the user's folder, and then a Brian folder inside the user's folder, and then finally a documents folder, which is inside the Brian folder. We have the ability to right-click on any given folder to create or rename or copy or delete folders. And again, I'm happy to report that software robots can perform these actions as well. Another thing that humans do is to create things called shortcuts, which allow us to access frequently used folders and files more quickly. So let's have a demo of this stuff. I've got a Windows Explorer window open again, and over here on the left side is a resizable navigation pane. And this is where we first see the notion of the parent-child relationships, or the tree structure I talked about earlier. If I find this PC or this computer, we can click on this chevron next to it to expand a list and see all of the children that this parent contains. These things on the top are folders, and these are disks. Notice over here on the right side, the disks and folders are separated or grouped into two different sections. If you use documents and downloads and pictures a lot, you would benefit from interacting with this section. I tend to interact with my drives more than these special folders, so I use this view a lot. Again, notice I'm in the details view here. There are two ways that I can view the folders inside each of these disks. I can either do it over here in the navigation pane by expanding the chevron next to any given disk, which exposes the child folders that are contained inside that disk. I could also have just as easily double-clicked on the C disk right here, and there I can see the same list of folders. But again, it's opening in the large icon view. I'm going to click on Details to make my experience more efficient. So at this point, I could continue on using these chevrons to drill deeper into nested directories, or by the same token, double-clicking here to drill deeper into this tree of nested folders. And like I mentioned, when we're interacting with any given folder, in this case, the recovery folder, if I click up here in this address bar, you'll notice the slashes I was talking about before for the separators. This recovery directory is in the C disk, and if I go into one of these drives, for instance, and drill down a little bit deeper into something like this apps trainer directory, and I again click up here in this address bar, you can see that this list of folders and files lives in the G disk, and there's our /separator, development directory, /separator, apps directory, /trainer. So that's the G disk, development directory, apps directory, trainer. As I mentioned on this slide, if we want a software robot to interact with a particular folder, we simply need to provide that robot with the right path for that folder. And this is exactly how we can do that. Once I'm in a particular location that I'm interested in, I can click up here, highlight, and Control-C to copy that whole path, and I can supply that path to a robot to allow it to very easily get back to this location. And I can prove that by simply closing that window, opening a new window, using Control-V to paste that path in, and hitting Return. And now we're rapidly right back to that place that we started from. Now, from the perspective of executing a manual process, I would certainly hope that a person wouldn't manually click through all these various folders to get back to this same location if they needed to use it every day. Because you can see how many clicks that takes. 1 click to expand the disk, 2 clicks to expand development, 3 clicks for apps, and 4 clicks for trainer. What I would rather have somebody do is to right-click and drag from that trainer directory and then let go someplace in a convenient location and then select Create Shortcuts here. So now we have a shortcut to that trainer directory. So anytime I want to get back there quickly, I can just double-click on that shortcut and I'm there. These are the kind of things you should be doing in your manual processes if you aren't already. It can certainly make things more efficient. Now, by the same token, if I had this file and I needed to copy the file into that trainer directory, obviously I wouldn't want to click through these directories like I did before to find that directory, because that would just be a really slow way to copy files. I could instead double-click on my shortcut to open that directory and drag and drop that file in. But what you may or may not know, as I delete this file, is that you can actually drag and drop a file right onto a shortcut. And that way, you've copied the file into that directory without ever having to open it. If I double click here, you'll see that my file is now inside my trainer directory. So some people may be using shortcuts to open directories quickly, but they may never have realized that you can actually drag and drop files right onto the shortcuts when you need to move those files around. It's great to have a better understanding of how folders and shortcuts work to improve our manual processes, but at the end of the day, it's important to correlate these manual tasks with the capabilities of your RPA tool. So here I've got an empty UiPath project open, and we would want to go over to the Activities pane here, and we'd want to explore. So if we click on System, for instance, we notice that there's a File node in here. And notice that we have activities like Create Directory or Path Exists. So this will allow us to determine whether a particular folder or file is present on our disk. If I type in folder at the top, you can see that we also have an activity that allows us to select a folder. So that could be handy if you're running your robot and it needs to interact with different kinds of folders. You could drag this Select Folder dialog into your robot and allow your users to choose. If I instead type Directory, notice we have an FTP node where we can check to see if an FTP directory exists, or we could create the FTP directory or remove that directory. And here again, we're seeing our system file create directory. So regardless of which RPA tool you're using, now that you have a better understanding of how folders work, it's great to experiment with your tool to see what it can do. We've taken a look at disks and folders. Now let's take a look at files. Files are simply documents holding some kind of data. They have extensions at the end of their name, like .txt, .xls, or PDF, etc. Those extensions are simply there to help the system understand which application should be used to open that file. It's a little bit unfortunate, but by default, these extensions are frequently hidden by the Windows operating system, which means you can't see them. Since we absolutely do need to see those file extensions for most RPA applications, be sure to go back and watch the Views lecture where I discuss setting up the appropriate view for your folders and enabling these file extensions to be shown. Software robots can get a list of files within a folder. We just need to provide the robot with the right path, the same way we did for folders. During our daily tasks, we often right-click to create, rename, move, copy, or delete files. And again, I'm happy to say that software robots can often perform these same actions. On occasion, we observe a particular folder to see whether files have been created or updated. Software robots could do this for us as well. Much like we did with folders, we also create shortcuts to access frequently used files more quickly. While this is good for us doing our work manually, it's not really relevant to robots because they can access a full path very quickly, over and over again. So for a quick demo about files, I'm back here in my Windows Explorer at G Development Apps Trainer, and you can see that the Trainer folder contains a list of folders and files. This window would normally open with the Home menu being visible, and when you select any given file, that shows you a bunch of options you have up here at the top. For instance, you could copy the path to this file, and of course that could be useful for supplying it to a robot activity. For our manual process, we've got these options here to move the file to a particular directory. We could do the same thing with copy. We could also delete the file, either placing it in the recycle bin or deleting permanently. We could rename the file, and so on. As I mentioned in the slides, one of the downfalls to Windows is that by default, it usually has this file name extensions unchecked. So if I was to dive into this Trainer app folder, you can see I have two executables because they both end with the .exe extension. This one ends with .log, which means it's a log file. And of course, if I wanted to interact with these files using a software robot, I would need to pass in the full name of the file, including the extensions. But of course, if this checkbox is off, we don't see those extensions, and Windows is setting us up to fail when we try to create a software robot. So again, it's a great idea to keep that checked. Hopefully you're aware that you can click on any file, and you can use the Control key and either X or C to cut or copy the file respectively. So in this case, I'll use Control X to cut the file, and I'll click up here on Trainer to move up one level in our directory tree, and then I'll use Control V to paste that same file at the Trainer level. When we go back down into Trainer app, you can see that file is no longer there. Jumping back up to Trainer, I can also right-click on the file and do the same thing. Here I'm going to select Cut again, go into Trainer app, and then right-click and use Paste. There are a variety of ways we can interact with our files. The idea is to find the way that uses the fewest clicks, and ideally have everybody on your team perform the process the same way. Bear in mind, the fastest way could be using keyboard shortcuts like I just showed you, or it could mean using this Home menu up here and clicking on this Cut icon. What a lot of people don't realize about the Windows file system is that these items up here in the path are actually shortcuts to these various directories. So instead of me clicking on this file, using Control X, then clicking here, then clicking here, then using Control V to paste, the faster way to do that exact same thing would be to right-click and drag on this file, hover over Trainer, let go, and say Move Here. So you can see how little things like that, if everybody applied them, could speed up your manual processes. So much like we did with folders, let's go to our RPA tool, in this case UiPath, and see what kind of activities are available for files. If I just delete my search term and jump down here to the System node, within the File node, we see things like Write text file, Read text file, again, path exists, move the file. File change trigger, as you can see, will monitor changes on a specific file or folder. And this is where I was talking about how the software robot could watch a particular folder to see if any files have changed or been recently updated. We can delete, we can create files, we can copy files, append a line into a file, and then if you expand this workbook node, you can see that we can do some Excel-related stuff as well, where we're reading and writing cells, reading rows, writing ranges, and so on. These activities are covered in my UiPath Excel section. What's interesting is, even though these things don't contain the word file in them, if you were to search for file up here in the top, you can see that UiPath still feels that these are relevant or related to files because they are contained within this file directory. So even though the activities themselves don't show the word file, by searching for file, we can see that these activities are available to us. We also have things like loading and saving an image, enumerating through a list of files on an FTP server, or checking whether the file exists or removing it. And again, down here we've got another dialog where we can select a file instead of selecting a folder. That gives you the ability to create a robot that allows the user to choose which file they'd like to operate on. So again, understand the process you do and the various file-related steps, and then take a look at your desired RPA tool and see what kind of file activities it has to help you automate that process. I'd like to talk briefly about screenshots because they are relevant to the Windows file system. Many of you are probably using third-party products like Snagit to capture screenshots, but I wanted to let you know that there's a pretty free and easy way to capture screenshots using the Windows operating system. The way to do it is to hold the Windows key, the Shift key, and then press your S key. And what that's going to do is to white out your screen and give you this little selection cursor. Then what you can do is you can drag a rectangle around whatever it is you want to screenshot and then let go. And now that region of the screen has been captured into the Windows clipboard. Then it's a simple matter of going to a Word document or PowerPoint presentation and using Ctrl-V to paste it in. Then you can resize and format it however you want to. In this case, I'll add a solid line around the outside, and I'll add a drop shadow to make it stand out a little bit more. Of course, screenshots are going to be really useful for capturing certain aspects of your process into a step-by-step document so that all the team members can be on the same page, and also RPA developers can fully understand the process and best automate it. So again here, Windows Shift S, and I'll select my desired region and let go. Then I'll go into an app like Word and Ctrl-V, resize, and format accordingly. So hopefully that will be beneficial to you in rapidly putting together step-by-step process documents. Now that we've learned more about disks and folders and files and how to interact with them manually, let's look at things from a different perspective. Windows ships a utility called the command prompt. Maybe you've heard people refer to it as a DOS prompt as well. And all it really is just a different way to navigate our disks and folders and files and to run apps. Using this utility, we can open, move, copy, delete folders and files, and even open websites. Of course, the first thing I can hear you asking is, why would I want to do this when I can just point and click instead? Well, it's because a computer can do it, and what that means is you can script it, and that ultimately means automation. Now, I'm lying to you a little bit here because using the command prompt is not the only way to automate this stuff anymore. The command prompt has always been the go-to method for scripting and automating basic tasks, but with the advent of these new RPA tools, we don't necessarily have to use the command line as much. But knowing how to use the command line can certainly help you create small enhancements to your manual workflow. And we'll have a demo of that in a couple minutes. The way to open a command prompt is to simply click on your Start menu at the bottom left of your screen and type the letters CMD, which is short for command. Then, you can type in a drive letter plus a colon to switch between different drives. You could also type a command called CD, which is short for change directory, and then either type in or copy and paste a desired path where you want to go. You can use the dir command to list the contents of a directory, and all that means is it's going to show us a list of the folders and files inside a directory. You can use the make dir command to create a new directory, and after you've run a few different commands in a session, you can use your keyboard's up arrow key to rerun previous commands. A quick Google of Windows command line tutorial will definitely give you a bunch more information about this. But let's go have a quick demo. As I mentioned, a fast way to open the command line is to simply click on the Start menu down here and start typing CMD, and that pulls up an item here called Command Prompt. Once the command prompt window is open, you can see that it's pointing at a certain path. In this case, the C disk in a user's directory and a Brian directory inside that. This is referred to as the current working directory. And that just means any command you run is going to be looking in that directory for something to do. As we've seen before, I have other disks on my computer, including my C drive, D drive, G drive, and J drive. So I can point this Windows command prompt at any of those by simply typing in D : and hitting return. So now you can see my current working directory is shorter and it's pointing at my D drive. So if I type in that dir command and hit return, I get a list of all the folders and files that are present in that D drive location. And you can see we get some data, including dates and times, and whether it's a directory or file and things like that. It also gives us a total countdown here, and some information about how many bytes are free. So why don't you follow along with me at this point and type in C: and hit return. And notice when I did that, it's pointing me at C users Brian instead of my C drive, because Windows is starting to get protective about allowing anything or anyone to modify the contents of the C drive. If I type in CD and then put in space C:/, now you can see I'm pointing at the root of C. But I had to try hard to get there. Windows is trying to encourage us to interact with things like the documents directory, downloads, music, pictures, and things like that. So I'm going to click on my C drive out here, and notice there are some directories prefixed with 01. I just do that so they float to the top of this list. So I'll move my command window over a little farther, and you can try this on your computer too, but just type in dir and hit return. So notice the list here matches what we see over here. 01 robot, 01 robot, 01 video, 01 video, and so on. Let's try to make a directory. mkdir space, and again I'll use 01 space my space new space folder. Now notice that I have multiple words for my folder file name. When I hit return, you can see that that appears to succeed. But if you click over here on your folder and scroll down to the bottom, notice what happened. Instead of getting one new directory called 01 my new folder, I got 4 new directories. Clearly that's not what I wanted to do. So I'm going to click on this and shift click down here, and then right click to delete those, and I'll use my up arrow to rerun that same command, but I'll use my left arrow key and I'll place a quote in front of the 01, and then I'll hit my end key and place a quote at the end. And now when I hit return, notice that we got 01 my new folder. So clearly, whenever you're dealing with spaces, you're going to have to wrap those words with quotes. I'm going to click on my folder and hit F5 so that my new folder sorts back to the top of the list. Now if I jump back over here, of course, if I type in dir and hit return, you can see that 01 my new folder is in our list. If we want to go inside 01 my new folder, we would simply double click on the window like that. But here we use CD space, and of course open our quotes, 01, and instead of having to retype all this, what I'll do instead is use my up arrow once and twice again, and then I'll use my left arrow key and just delete this first part and change that to CD. So you can see that saved us some time. Now when I hit return, my current working directory is pointing at C:/01 my new folder. Now if I type in dir, you can see that it's reporting that the only things inside there are this dot and this ... That means that this directory is empty. When your command prompt window starts to get too full of text, you can type in CLS, which means clear screen. And when you hit return then, now you've got a fresh command line window. I won't show you too much more about command prompt because it isn't really the core focus of this course, but I will show you another example here. If I type the word echo and open my quotes and say, this is some text, and then close my quotes and hit return, notice it echoes, this is some text into this window here. If I use my up arrow on the keyboard to bring that last command back, and then add another space at the end, put in a greater than symbol, open up some more quotes, and type in a text file.txt, and then close my quotes, now what's going to happen is that same text is going to be written into a new text file inside of our directory. If I double click on that, sure enough, there's the text we wrote into it. And finally, if I wanted to copy this file from the C drive to the D drive, I could use my up arrow a couple of times until I get back to the name of this folder that I created, and I can back up to this CD, change it to xcopy, and I'll add in the full path C:/01 my new folder, use my N key to jump to the end, add one more space, open some quotes, and type in D:// and close up my quotes. When I hit return, you can see it says one file was copied. And if I go over to my D drive, there's the file that we copied. So again, I don't expect you to become a command prompt expert, but learning this stuff is going to allow you to think a little bit more like a robot, so it will be easier for you to interact with your RPA tool and provide the right paths to the different RPA activities. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about a concept called absolute path versus relative path. This is going to be relevant to our command prompt work, but also when using any kind of an RPA activity that requires a path. Sometimes we'll provide an absolute path, sometimes we'll provide a relative path, and it's up to you to determine which one is most appropriate for the current situation. An absolute path is always going to start at the beginning, and it's going to contain every step of the entire path. So you can see here that I've got a CD, which means change directory. And it starts at the C drive, goes into the user's directory, into Brian, into my folder. And of course, since there's a space in that one, I would have to put quotes around it. In the second example, we're going to create a new directory on the D disk, and you can see we've specified the entire path there. So the absolute path is always going to start at the very beginning, including the drive letter. A relative path is going to start with either // or // or potentially a combination of multiple of those. In each of these four examples, I'm going to change directory. In the first one, I'm using cd // and changing directory into my folder. Using a single dot with a slash like that means that we're going to look within our current working directory for a folder called my folder and change directory into there. What's important to realize here is that my folder could be 6 levels deep on the E drive, but this particular command doesn't care where it is because it's operating relative to where it currently is. The assumption here is that we would have previously used a cd command to navigate down into the current working directory, whatever that may be. But this next cd command is occurring relative to where we currently are. So again, a single dot with a slash means start within your current working directory and interact with anything on that same level. // is a signal to go up to our parent directory. That's the directory that contains our current working directory. So in this case, we're instructing to go up to our parent and then go into a folder called my folder inside of our parent. We do have the ability to chain these things together. So if we use .. that means go up to the parent's parent directory and start looking in there. And by the fourth example, I think you get the idea. Let's put our hands on this and try it out. So go down to your Start menu at the bottom left and type in CMD and hit return, and that should get you a fresh command prompt window. You can see that my current working directory is C:/users/Brian. So that means that I'm 2 directories deep inside my C drive. You are most likely looking at a different path. So to get us both in the same position, let's click on here and type in cd space C:/. That is an absolute path. Even though it only has the drive letter, you can see that we're starting from the beginning. Hit return, and now you should be staring at C:/, just like I am. So now let's create a new directory. Type in mkdir, or MD for short, and we'll call this one first. And since we're currently pointing at the C drive, that's our current working directory. So a new directory called first is going to be created on the root of your C drive. Hit return. So now we don't have any evidence that that was successful, but what you can do is type in dir and hit return, and you can see in the list, first is definitely there. So type in CLS to clear your screen, and now we can type in cd space, and our goal here is to change our current working directory to that new directory we just created. So we could do it one of 2 ways. We could use an absolute path or a relative path. As I mentioned, using an absolute path, we're going to have to start with the very beginning of the path and include the whole thing. So we would type in cd space C:/first. and hit return. So now you can see our current working directory is C:\first. Let's try it using a relative path instead. First though, let's use our up arrow key as many times as necessary to get back to CD C:\. Now we're changing our working directory back to the root of the C drive. Hit return. This time, I'm going to type CD space. I'll use .\first. So notice I'm not telling it which drive I want it to look on. It's going to try to find first relative to our current working directory. So if I hit return, notice the exact same result happens. So that's a very basic example of the difference between absolute and relative path. The last time that we changed our working directory to the C drive, we used an absolute path. Can you see now how we can change directory back to the C drive using a relative path? Well, instead of typing in CD space C:\, like we did before, we're going to use CD space ... So again, that's telling the command prompt to go up and look in the parent directory that contains us. So when I hit return, there we go. We're pointing at the C drive. Notice I didn't need to tell it which drive to look in. It simply took action relative to where we were currently pointing. It went up to its parent. So let's do one more example of this to really bring the idea home. Use your up arrow key as many times as necessary to get back to your make dir or MD command. Last time, we did MD first, which created a first directory inside of our C drive. This time, we're going to add a backslash after that and type in the word second. So now we're going to create a directory called second inside of a directory called first. So when I hit return, that happens successfully. So, can you think of a way to navigate into the second directory using a relative path? Normally what we would do is type in CD space C:\first/second, right? That's an absolute path because it begins with the drive letter. And this will definitely work, but what I'm going to do is back up here to just before this slash and use my backspace key twice and simply add a single dot. So that single dot, again, is saying, look in the current working directory, right? So we are going to CD into a directory called first that lives in our current working directory, and then go down into the second directory from there. So this is a relative path that's going to change our working directory to be 2 directories deeper. So hit return, and look at that. We are now pointing at C first second. So now use an absolute path to get us back to the first directory. Type in CD space C:\first and hit return. We can go back into second by using CD space .\second because now we're operating relative to the first directory. Hit return, and we're back inside C:\first/second. Now, how can we use a relative path to get all the way back up to the C drive? Can you figure that out? Of course, the first thing you're going to do is type in CD space, and of course, an absolute path would be to use C:\. But we don't want to use an absolute path, we want to use a relative path. And as you recall, ... tells us to go to our parent directory. That would take us into the C:\first directory. We don't want to go there. We want to go a directory higher. We want to go to our parent's parent, right? So I'll use ... and then another ... And when I hit return, we're back to our C drive. So hopefully that's helpful for understanding the difference between absolute and relative paths, because this will definitely come in handy for various scripting, programming, and RPA tasks. So congratulations for making it through all of these lectures about disks and folders and files and paths and the command prompt. You might be thinking to yourself, wow, that's really neat that I have this extra understanding of the Windows file system, but how can I apply this? I'm hoping this lecture will really tie everything together and give you some ideas about how you can make small improvements in your manual processes that will not only make them more efficient, but also help you move in the direction of creating RPA software robots. So let's talk about batch files. A batch file is simply a sequence of Windows commands contained in one file. And as far as the sequence of commands goes, we could do something like opening up 2 different websites and 2 different directories with one click. Maybe you have a manual task that requires you to navigate to 2 different sites and have 2 different directories open to move files around. So instead of opening the browsers, navigating to those sites, and then navigating to each of those 2 directories, you could simply double-click on one thing and all that stuff would happen at the same time. Of course, this prevents us from having to retype commonly used commands and having to perform manual actions like opening websites over and over again. Batch files are easy to create. We start by creating a new text file. Then we add whatever Windows commands we want into the text file. For example, the start command can be really useful. Then we save and close the text file and change its file extension from .txt to .bat, which is just short for batch file. Batch files are easy to run. You simply double-click on it, but you also have the option to schedule it using Windows Task Scheduler. Of course, RPA tools can be used instead of batch files because they're certainly more capable of doing lots more things than the batch file might be able to do. But once you know about these Windows commands and paths and how batch files can work, it might help you ask better questions in your RPA meetings to determine whether there are any existing batch files that already do work that you could leverage to build your software robots more quickly. So let's have a demo of how batch files work. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that you have a process that requires you to have 2 different directories open and 2 different websites. And one of the websites has to be open in Chrome. So the directories we're dealing with are going to be inside this G drive in the 01 important source data. So I need to have that folder open. And then here in my J drive, there's a 01 system B directory and important destination. So the idea is I have to take information from G important source data, and maybe I need to move it into J system B important destination. And for the sake of this demo, let's say that I have to have the Amazon.com website open, as well as a website called StackOverflow.com in the Chrome browser. So I've got 2 different browser windows and 2 different Windows directories that I have to have open. So of course, I don't want to spend the time opening my 2 browsers and navigating to those websites and navigating to these different directories. Clearly, I could create shortcuts for each of these directories, and that would speed things up to some degree. But let's see if there's a faster way. So as I mentioned in the slides, batch files are easy to create. I'll just right-click wherever I want and select New Text Document, and I'll just rename this Work Faster and hit Return and double-click to open it. So nothing special here, just a normal text file. And what's important to understand is that you could type in cd :/, first if you wanted to, or make dir, or xcopy, or any Windows command you want. The idea here is that this file is going to contain a sequence of Windows commands that will execute automatically when we run this file. Instead of doing those commands though, we're going to use the start command. And start has 2 pieces to it. The first one is which application do you want to run. In this case, I'll type in Explorer, and I'll hit space, and I'll go to that starting directory here, G important source data, and I'll click here to copy, Control-C, and paste that in. You can see there's a bunch of spaces in there, so we need to wrap that up with double quotes, and hit return. Now to save time, I'm going to Control-C and copy that and paste that here, because we want to start our second directory as well. So I'll jump back in here and navigate down to that second directory, which is this one here, J system B important destination. I'll select and Control-C to copy that path, and inside these double quotes, I will paste that in. So now you can see that we're going to start Explorer to this path, start Explorer to that path, go to the end and hit return again, and type in start. This time I'll type in Chrome because I want to open the Chrome browser, and that could also be in double quotes if you want, but it doesn't have to be because these are all one word. So in this case, I'll go to the Chrome browser and select that desired web address we want to go to, and I'm going to close Chrome to get rid of it. So I'll paste in that address, hit return one more time, type in start, and in this case I'm just going to use 2 double quotes to indicate that I want it to use whatever the default web browser is. And I'll go back to Edge here and select that path, Control-C to copy, and paste that in here. So you can see I have 4 start commands, each of which has 2 parts to it: the application to start and the destination. We've used double quotes wherever there are spaces in the path. Control-S to save and close that up. I'm going to close all of my windows there and close all the browsers too. Now I'll just click on this file name to select and rename the extension to .bat. Click Yes to accept the change. And now you can see that the icon has changed to some gears, which gives you a sense of what's about to happen here. When I double click on this, it's going to automatically run those 4 commands, or however many commands I've typed in. So this is the beginnings of some simple automation. So I have no Explorer windows open and no browser windows open. I'll just double click on this and see what happens. And as quickly as that, you can see that I now have this browser, this window, and that window. You saw how fast that went. So this is a little bit of a contrived example, but I'm hoping it gives you some ideas about how you can apply your new knowledge of disks and folders and files and paths and command line stuff along with a batch file and see if that might be able to help speed up some of your manual processes. Bear in mind that the Windows commands in your batch file could have been to copy or move files from directory to directory, or to create new directories. For instance, if you're setting up a new hire, you could create a batch file that automatically creates a bunch of directories on their machine that you know they're going to need. The possibilities are endless. And again, a modern RPA tool can do all of this stuff better than a simple Windows batch file can do. But I'm hoping that this kind of knowledge can help you start thinking about the big picture and thinking more along the lines of how a robot thinks, and you can ask the right questions about whether any batch files like this already exist that you might be able to take advantage of when you're building a software robot. In the batch file video, you learned how you could take your path skills and your command line skills and create a simple automation script. That's a useful, free, and easy way to make an improvement to your manual workflow. In this lecture, I'd like to give you a taste of what a modern RPA tool brings to the table compared to using a batch file. This is a hands-on lecture, so let's jump right in. There are a number of RPA tools on the market that we could use for this example, but I'll be using UiPath, so if you'd like to follow along, go ahead and pause this course and head over to my UiPath RPA Level 1 course to get yourself set up with UiPath so you can follow the steps of this exercise. I've already got UiPath launched, so I'm going to click on this blank tile here to create a new project. I'll call this Simple Task Setup and copy and paste this, and I'm saving it into C Development UiPath. So I click on Create. You may recall that our batch file did 4 things. We opened 2 directories to these paths, then we opened a Chrome browser to Stack Overflow, and the default IE browser to Amazon.com. Obviously this is a simple, contrived example, but there's certainly a possibility that a task that you might have would require opening certain directories and certain web applications. So in this lecture, let's see what it takes to recreate something like this batch file using a modern RPA tool. Now, if you decided you didn't want to learn the technical skills required to do this, you could take the functional flowchart approach that I described in the flowchart section and simply go into your activities, type flowchart, click and drag a flowchart into your workspace, click up here to change the name of this, maybe call it Setup My Task, and then go back into activities and type in sequence and click and drag a sequence in, and maybe rename this one as open source folder. Then I'll Control-C to copy and Control-V to paste that and say open destination folder. Control-C, Control-V again. We'll say open website A. Scroll down a little bit, click Control-V to paste, and call this one open website B. Then I'll hit the control button and use my mouse wheel to zoom back a little bit And now what we can do is hover over the start node, drag an arrow, hover over the bottom of this one, drag an arrow, repeat here, drag, and finally repeat here to drag. Click on this and use my down arrow to space it out a little bit. And now we've got a functional flowchart. And this could be handed off to a developer to add the necessary activities to cause these things to happen. To make their job easier, you could right-click on these things and say Annotation, Add Annotation. And you know the path you're trying to open for the source folder. That's here in our batch file. So you could copy that and paste it in here to give them a hint of what you want to do. You could say, Open my folder, right? And then you could Control-C to copy that, right-click here, add another annotation, paste that in, go back to the batch file and grab this path, Control-C to copy, and then select this path right here before the word folder and Control-V to paste it in. So now you're leaving the RPA developer some notes about what you need to do here. And of course, you could put in notes for which websites you wanted to open as well. So that's the approach for creating a functional flowchart that an RPA developer could help you build out. I'll hit Control-S to save that file so we don't lose our work. Now, if you decided that you would rather get your hands dirty and try to build this robot yourself, now it's a matter of trying to figure out which activities to use in these various blocks to accomplish what we did in our batch file. In these first two lines, we are opening folders. In the second two lines, we're opening browsers. So your first instinct might be to go and look for an open folder activity. So if you go into activities and you click on this, and you type folder up here in the search, notice there's nothing that says open folder. We have the ability to select a folder, but that just allows us to choose a folder that the robot can use to do some work. So you think maybe it's directory instead. Again, nothing here says open directory. So, are we stuck? Well, this is where I'd like to teach you to fish instead of giving you a fish. What you should do in a case like this is open up a browser and go to Google, or just type up here in the address, type UiPath open folder, and hit return. Now, obviously, if you were using a different tool, you would type in the name of the tool here instead of UiPath. But in this case, we're using UiPath, so I'm looking for open folder. And then, of course, you're going to click on any one of these links here to do some research to see what others say about how to accomplish this task. In this one, we're on forum.uipath.com, which is a great resource. And the reply here is to use the Open Application activity. Click on the folder to identify it. In the Properties panel, in the Working Directory option, put the path of the folder between quotes. And that may sound a little mysterious to you if you're not technical, but if you take a breath and analyze this, you'll discover that he's talking about some things that you've already learned. We know what an activity is, so we would need to look for the Open Application activity. Then it says you would need to click on the folder to identify which one you want, and then in the Properties panel, which is this section over here on the top right, in the Working Directory option, you're going to put a path of the folder between quotes. So you know what Working Directory means. That's the current working directory thing I was talking about in the batch file section. So notice that learning about the concept of current working directory is already starting to pay off. We also learned about paths, so you can see that we need to put the path of our desired folder inside some quotes in a working directory section. So the first thing I'll do is double click to go inside this sequence, because this is where I want to perform that activity. So I double click, then I click on Activities, and type in Open Application. And sure enough, we've got an Open Application activity. So I could click and drag that on, and let's see if the stuff he was talking about exists. First of all, we do have a link here that will allow us to indicate the window on the screen. So in theory, if we click on this link, it's going to allow us to choose the window that we want to find. Then over here in Properties, if we scroll down a little bit lower, you can see that there's an options section that has a working directory field. And that's exactly what he was talking about in that forum post. And when you hover over this, it says all string variables must be placed between quotes. So what that means is that we would need to grab this path that we're looking for, Control-C to copy, Control-C to paste it in there, and that would achieve the objective he was talking about in that forum reply. Then we would simply open up an Explorer window and click up here in the address bar and paste in our desired path without those quotes on it, hit return, and now we're in the location we want to be. So we would click on this link to indicate that window, and in theory we could click on it and it would fill in this information over here to specify that window. Since I'm using a screen recorder right now, that doesn't work for me because the screen recorder prevents me from selecting that directory. You could try it to see if it works, but I'm going to show you an alternative approach that's a little more simple than this to accomplish this goal. Instead of using open application, if we look at our batch file, we're using a command called start. And what are we doing? We're starting an application called Explorer. Another word for application is process. Application and process can be used interchangeably. So in the first two, we're opening the Explorer process. In the second two, we're opening the Chrome process and the default browser process, respectively. So start process. If I jump over here to activities and I type in the word process, notice we have an activity called start process. So that's actually very similar to what we're doing here. So I'll control zoom in and then right click to delete this, open application. And I'll click to drag my start process in here. And notice this is a more simple activity and it's only really asking for the executable path, which is the path to our process, and then some app arguments, which in this case can be the path to the directory that we want to open. And notice this one also has a working directory field that we could supply as well. So it's a good thing you learned about that. So when we open a Windows desktop window like this is happening inside of a process called Windows Explorer. If I go into OS and scroll down to the bottom and double click on Windows, and I type in expl, notice I've got this explorer.exe. This application, this process, is what is opening these windows. So the path to this process is going to be C Windows explorer.exe. So I'll select that and copy it and get rid of that window. And back here in UiPath, I'll open my double quotes, which also creates some closing quotes for me. And I'll paste that in, add a backslash, and type in explorer.exe. So that's very similar to this line right here. Now I need to pass in this path and paste that right here. So that's it. We've replaced this line of our batch file with a very simple activity. If you wanted to paste that same folder path into working directory, you could do that as well, but we don't need that for now. So now that we figured this out, I'm going to click on this, Control C to copy it, jump back here to set up my task, double click on Open Destination Folder, click inside here and Control V to paste, because we're going to open that same application to a different path. The path we want is this one, so I'll Control C to copy that, select and Control V to paste there. So believe it or not, we've already got the first two steps of our robot done. Now we just need to figure out how to open a browser. Well, let's go to our activities here, select, type in browser, and what do you know? Open browser. So let's double click on this one and click and drag open browser in there, and it says insert URL here. Text must be quoted. So what are we doing? The first one we want to open is this one. So I'll copy that URL, Control C, open my double quotes, which also closes them, and Control V. So there we go. But notice, in this one we're opening Chrome. So how do we do that? Over here in the properties, notice there's a browser type, and if I click on that, as long as I have Chrome installed and set up, I can click on Chrome. That requires that you go over here to Setup and use Setup Extensions to set up your Chrome extension. And I cover that in the UiPath Level 1 course. So that's really it. We've opened a browser. Again, I'll click on that, Control C to copy, jump to set up my task, scroll down, double click on Open Website B, click in there and Control V to paste. And of course, in this case, we want to open Amazon.com, so I'll Control C to copy that. And inside my quotes, making sure not to disturb them, I'll Control V to paste in Amazon.com. And in this one, I can change the browser type back to IE. Click on Set up my task. And believe it or not, we've just created the entire software robot ourselves. Control S to save the file. And the point that I really want to drive home about using an RPA tool versus the batch file is that in the batch file we have 4 lines. And all we're really doing is opening 2 directories and opening 2 browsers to certain URLs. What's amazing about this RPA tool is that now we're set up to do more things after we've opened our folders and websites. In case you didn't notice, when I double-click on this Open Website A activity, after I open the web browser to this URL, there's already a sequence inside here that says do. And of course, we can rename that to whatever we want, but the point is, this sequence is here to allow us to add more activities, such as supplying the login credentials, maybe typing some data into a registration form, creating invoices, whatever. So where the batch file allows us to do the first step to set up our task, the RPA tool does those things, but also allows us to add more activities that can potentially automate more of the task, or even all of the task. So let's give this thing a run and see if it even works. Click on the Start button. And the robot is done, so it came back. I'll minimize this, and you can see that we have an Amazon window. And if I minimize that, we've got a Stack Overflow window. If I minimize that, we've got our source data open and our destination as well. So the robot did exactly what our batch file was previously doing. So that's pretty cool. We covered a lot in this Windows file system section, so let's have a look at some takeaways. As I mentioned, humans perform processes that involve disks and folders and files. Understanding the Windows operating system can help users optimize and standardize their processes, meaning they should all use the same view on their folders, use the same shortcuts, and whatever batch files are created, and so on. This knowledge can help instill confidence when you're building software robots and/or communicating problems with existing robots to the developers who built them. This knowledge can help you generate more accurate estimates because you have more confidence about what's happening behind the scenes, and you can also ask better questions. For instance, finding out if there's any existing batch files or other utilities that could be leveraged when you're building robots. You're going to want to strive to make a correlation between the disks and folders and files and paths in a manual process versus the capabilities of the RPA tool you've chosen. You're going to want to know which steps of your process your chosen tool can or cannot automate. So hopefully this section took your Windows operating skills to the next level and piqued your curiosity to potentially do some extra research to learn more about Windows commands and things like that.